Performance podcast. My name is Jack McLean and I'm your host, and I am lucky enough to be joined by Thomas Santos as our guest. We'll be discussing everything that you need to know when it comes to multi-directional speed, both from the research perspective and of course practical tips. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for jumping on, mate. Really looking forward to our chat.
No, thank you very much for the invitation, Jack. I really looking forward to it. It's a great honour.
No doubt, mate. Obviously, you've been in a few podcasts before, and people will be well aware of your research and your practical experience. But for those tuning in that aren't aware, do you mind providing, I guess, where it all started for you, your passion for high performance and different experiences along your journey?
Yes, and I suppose started off in the profession like many of us as a kind of failed athlete, I suppose. So I was really interested. I thought I was going to be a soccer player based in the UK. So yeah, had dreams. I thought I was going to be a pro, but that didn't materialize. So I decided to get into sports science and study that at the University of Salford. I was really interested in to work with athletes, learning how to make them faster, stronger, how can we win medals and that type of stuff. So I studied at the University of Salford under like Professor Paul Comfort, John McMahon, Paul Jones. And I was interested in change direction through Paul Jones, who was my supervisor for my PhD. But that started as an undergrad, probably about 15 years ago now. So we did a project looking at the effect of muscle strength asymmetry on change of direction. Then I decided to do a master's in strength conditioning. So again, Paul Comfort was a very big influence on Paul Jones and John McMahon. And again, I studied with Paul Jones again, looking at isometric strength relationships with change of direction performance. So we did a lot of research with the isometric mid-thigh pull and trying to see what kind of determinants relate to kind of 180-degree turning performance. But we also did the change of direction task across two force plates or force platforms to look at some of the braking and propulsive characteristics during the change of direction step as well. Unfortunately, I was able to publish my master's project, and during my master's is where I met Dr. Chris Thomas, who's based at Aspetar now, who works with a reconditioning with ACL. So he's had a big influence on my career as well. So during my master's, worked with Chris Thomas teaching and with the netball squad, England Northwest Netball. So learned a lot through him. And then he was doing his PhD alongside that as well. And that's where I got the motivation and where I decided I wanted to pursue a PhD in change of direction. So fortunately, through Paul Comfort and Paul Jones, I was able to get a PhD studentship fully funded through the university. And essentially my PhD was kind of continuation of Paul Jones and Chris Thomas's work. So Paul Jones initially was looking at ACL risk factors in female soccer players. Chris Thomas was looking at the effect of like, muscle strength asymmetry and interlimb asymmetries on like more 180-degree turning performance and change direction performance. But my PhD kind of expanded more on looking at technical determinants of cutting and 180-degree turns, looking at screening tools as well. And we were fortunate enough to do 2 training interventions as well as part of my PhD. One of which was with like a professional soccer academy called Salford City FC. So we did an intervention with their youth 17s and 18s. And then we also did an intervention which was funded by the NSCA through the doctoral program. So we did a 6-week multi-directional speed intervention, and we monitored the biomechanical changes in cutting and turning performance from both performance and injuries perspectives. And yeah, it was really, really interesting, really good time at Salford. And then the last 5 years, I transferred to the other side of the city. Now working with Manchester Metropolitan University, and now I'm supervising PhD students in all aspects of multi-directional speed. So it isn't just change direction, but really interested in decel, linear speed, curve linear speed, and been able to collaborate with a range of different people in those areas as well. So yeah, it's been a whirlwind last 15 years, but a lot of people have influenced and shaped my career into all aspects of multi-directional speed.
There's some big names there early on in your career, no doubt. Strong influences with your philosophy. I guess on that, like reflecting on on sort of your stance on deceleration and multi-directional speed. Have you mentioned everyone that's been the biggest influence so far, or have there been some other sort of mentors that have helped
Oh
along
yeah,
the
so
way?
sorry, there was one final one as well. So I watched a presentation on the NSCA's website by Sean Miaska. I believe it was called Slamming on the Brakes. I think it was
Okay.
back in 2013 or 2014, and he was just basically highlighting back then. I think it's a bit different now, but like 10, 15 years ago, there was this big emphasis on how much do you squat, how much do you clean, but there was kind of this underappreciation of how well an athlete moves, particularly from like a decel and change direction. So that kind of inspired me to actually start thinking, yes, the underpinning physical qualities are important, no doubt about it. You need to be able to produce force quickly, and that's definitely going to be underpinned by resistance training. But I think that ability to coach athletes and coach these movement skills and what going to differentiate the kind of average or practitioner from the kind of world leading practitioner. So that's something that I'm definitely highlighting and emphasizing a lot more with the students that I teach now. Yes, we need to coach, we need to be confident in the weight room, but I think that ability to transfer those physical qualities out into the field of court are definitely really important. So that appreciation of movement quality, how do we coach and teach these ideal technical models, and then equally, not only in a one-to-one environment, but can you try and achieve some sort of technical modification or transfer when working with large, big squads, which could be a challenge. But yeah, that's definitely a big area. So been able to speak to Sean a few times, so that was definitely a big influence there. And then I suppose some of the big people now who are really influencing me, challenging me. I work with Alistair McBurney, who's kind of one of my business partners through Science of Multi-Directional Speed. So he's working at Manchester United. Work closely with Damien Harper. So we have a lot of shared interests in terms of deceleration. So again, we challenge each other. Very thought-provoking, and I work closely with Chris Brammer, who's developed the sprint mechanics assessment screening tool. So from kind of like a linear speed perspective and hamstring injury, they're kind of some of the three people that I work quite closely at the moment. Again, target different aspects of multi-directional speed, and then obviously I work closely with Chris Thomas and Paul Jones as well. So they've been some of my biggest influences. And more recently now, Dr. Phil Graham-Smith, who I work with at Manchester Metropolitan University. So I believe he's been on your show. He was formerly at the University of Salford. So he did a lot of the early research looking at penultimate foot contact with Paul Jones, and he went to Aspire, for 10 years. And now I'm working closely with him. Now we're supervising a few students. We have a PhD student at Manchester United, women's, looking at movement profiling, particularly deceleration and change direction, and linking it back to ACL injury risk. So yeah, very, very thought-provoking and challenging my views on how we condition, screen, and monitor as well. So yeah, a lot of stuff going on. But yeah, really, really enjoyable times at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, let's dive into the topic, and it's probably quite an open-ended question, but I guess something that you mentioned earlier in terms of performance and injury mitigation. You know, I guess how different would your process be and coaching be when looking to maybe a late stage performance phase for an ACL athlete that you're returning them to preparing them to play, perhaps their sort of 6 to 8 month sort of phase, compared to maybe working with maybe an athlete that's reached out to you in the off season and is looking to improve their power cutting ability from their healthy athlete, looking to improve their stepping ability to create space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great question. Great question. I suppose maybe a good starting point would be just to define what we're meaning by like a change of direction. So it's probably the most complex skill, and there's so many different types of change of direction actions. So essentially we're just referring to like a reorientation and change in path of travel of the whole body center of mass. So that typically involves some manipulation of your base of support relative to your center of mass. So you're saying step in, so that maybe like a side step cut where we're going to abduct at the hip, laterally plant our foot and push away to the opposite direction. It's kind of like your most common action, but there are kind of like a wealth of different change of direction actions that your athletes can perform depending on the nature of the sport. So in your ball carrying sports, so Aussie rules football, handball, rugby, those type of, there might be like double steps, triple steps, jump steps, split steps. You've got your crossover cuts, even extreme scenarios. You've got spin maneuvers, particularly see in American football and basketball. And then you've got like your decel and kind of pivoting type of actions for your more aggressive, normally anything greater than 110 degrees. And like you mentioned, they're key for performance, so typically for creating separation from an opponent, particularly in those evasive ball-carrying sports, but also just in terms of reorientating and deflecting your center of mass, whether you need to change path of travel, whether that's in response to a ball, opponent, scoring points in certain sports, such as cricket, baseball, and so on. And then if you think about your racket type of sports, such as squash, badminton, every time they perform a shot, they're going to perform some form of change of directions, get back to the tee. So they're linked to these kind of key elements of performance, but they're also got some inherent risk of injury. And I think it's very difficult to 100% eradicate risk of injury during change of direction, because some of the techniques necessary for faster performance could predispose athletes to greater mechanical loading, and there's going to be some sort of trade-off. So whether you're working with a healthy athlete or rehabilitating a player, I think that you just need to be aware that there's going to be some trade-off, I suppose, but you probably need to decide how much a trade-off there is, or how much you're going to expose them to kind of safety or injury risk. And undoubtedly, as athletes run faster, the mechanical load into the tissues are going to be greater, but we can't really tell our athletes to avoid those scenarios in sport, which is quite challenging. We can't really wrap them up in cotton wool. But I think what we need to do is kind of physically prepare our athletes for those physical demands associated with change of direction, particularly the loading around the knee. And there is a bit of evidence showing that we can improve the co-activation of the knee spanning and non-knee spanning musculature. We can offset some of that loading, which is going to be highly important. And also there are certain technical deficits that we do want to try and address, regardless if they're healthy or late stage rehab, that maybe offer no associated performance benefits, but will reduce risk of injury. So for example, we want to make sure that we're trying to reduce maybe knee valgus, or that initial knee valgus posture. That there isn't really any evidence to show that it will optimize performance, but it will definitely reduce risk of injury. There's a lot of evidence showing knee valgus to be a strong determinant of potentially hazardous knee joint loads, particularly these knee valgus moments. Trunk control is quite a topical issue at the moment. So from a pre-planned perspective, if we can shift our trunk towards the direction that we want to be changing direction, that's going to more optimally align our center of mass towards the intended direction of travel. But it's also going to reduce some of the knee valgus moments and the load at the tissue. So if I'm performing a sidestep cut, if I'm moving my right foot laterally to push off towards the left, I want to try and potentially tilt my pelvis and orientate my trunk towards the left. So from a pre-planned perspective, great. However, one typical cue that we hear practitioners say all the time is drop the shoulder to try and evade the opponent. And that normally coincides with us dropping our trunk towards the stance leg, which is going to elevate potentially knee joint loads, because we want to laterally direct our ground reaction force vector. So again, there's some sort of trade-off there. I think what we need to be aware of is, if you're coaching athletes that technique, just acknowledge there could be an increased risk of injury there. But again, we're there to win, deceive opponents. So that's something to be mindful of. Certain aspects which I do believe that could be simultaneously beneficial for performance and mitigate risk of injury is the emphasizing the penultimate foot contact and the prior braking steps, depending on the angle of change of direction. So we discuss a concept known as the angle velocity trade-off. So as the intended angle of change of direction increases, the braking requirements increase, which is, again, not rocket science. So typically for your shallow change of directions, anywhere from like 0 to 45, there should be probably limited braking. However, as that intended change of direction angle increases from 45 degrees and greater, there does seem to be some braking force requirements with that penultimate foot contact, and potentially several steps depending on your entry velocity, your momentum, and the intended change of direction angle. But so we would suggest that maximizing braking at that penultimate foot contact, so that step before, which is typically performed in the sagittal plane, you go through a greater range of motion as well. It's typically a safer strategy. And we've shown in lab studies that athletes who display those strategies display faster turning performance or cutting performance, because that final foot contact can focus more on propulsion. But we can also reduce some of the loading experienced in that turning foot contact as well. And I know for certain change direction angles, there may not be that much braking that's involved, particularly for those, maybe like if you're doing a 20 or 30 degree cut. But we would argue that penultimate foot contact is really important for setting you up a preparation step to make sure that you get to the correct postures when you are about to push off from that cut or turn. So we do consider that to be mutually beneficial for performance and injury risk. And when we're rehabbing players, from my experience, we do put a lot of emphasis on mastering deceleration. And we feel like if you can master deceleration, that should hopefully set you up, particularly when you're focusing on turn mechanics, because essentially you're deconstructing a 180-degree turn with an initial accel, a deceleration phase. You've got your plant during the change of direction and the reacceleration phase. If you can master that deceleration, that will definitely set you up for a good position to push off and reaccelerate out of the turn. When if we're more like your cutting or sidestep cutting mechanics, again, we would kind of deconstruct our cutting technique as well, mastering deceleration, getting towards that final foot contact and learning how to plant in those kind of optimal positions there, and then adding in the reacceleration component as well. I know I've gone off on so many tangents there,
that's
but
great.
hopefully...
Yeah, that's a great way to open it up and just provide a bit of context in terms of where we're heading, I guess, with the chat. Because often it is sort of mentioned in the industry that performance and injury mitigation are one and two things, but I think I tend to agree with sort of your sentiment there that there are some differences. Like what you talk about with the trunk position. If you want to try and influence the defense with what you're doing with your trunk position to create confusion, but that might not be best for the actual athlete that's on the offense with their knee, for example. So there's sort of two competing, a bit of a trade-off there, like you said. Do you feel, and it's probably a hard one to measure, but like going into, I guess, to screening for risk of mitigation, when you're watching vision of an ACL occur, and obviously there's the valgus of the knee and the trunk discipline, there's some biomechanical trends there, but is it a matter of that just broke the camel's back, so to speak, that particular, because obviously you watch a lot of vision, and in chaos environments of sport, there's lots of ugly postures that athletes get into with high force, and then they're fine, and then you watch a vision of an ACL occur and they might have done that 100 times and be okay, but then that one time they do it, especially in the non-contact ACLs. Is it, what do you think are the big things that are leading up to that point? Is it high back-to-back training sessions, high training load, lots of small-sided games, perhaps lots of accel, decel, strain on the knee joint from that perspective? Is there things to look at with your gym program that could be predisposing fatigue to that area? For example, if you're getting into those shapes that aren't as efficient and that athlete is doing that over and over again, are they predisposing themselves to a higher risk compared to an athlete that is efficient, do you think? Maybe let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah,
in terms of
great question. So I suppose we can break it down into the actual mechanism of injury itself, or how does tissue failure occur? So for any injury to a tissue, whether it be bone, ligament, muscle, or tendon, essentially it needs to experience a mechanical load, normally stress or strain to the tissue, which exceeds the tolerance capacity. So like we mentioned before, when you perform a change of direction, you have the potential to generate these large mechanical loads to the ACL and other tissues. So it isn't just an ACL, but we can get injuries to ankle injuries, adductor injuries, hamstring strain injuries, but we focus primarily on the knee. So like you said, was it the straw that broke the camel's back? We have that single catastrophic event where various movement quality technical deficits, like extended knee posture, lateral trunk flexion, combined with knee valgus with maybe some externally directed attention, which has been shown to increase knee joint loads. And if those knee joint loads are high enough and exceeds the tolerance capacity, that will result in that rupture. So you got that kind of single catastrophic event. But I like what you mentioned about the kind of fatigue and that kind of straw that broke the camel's back. And there's a bit of evidence showing there could be like this fatigue failure or tissue or mechanical fatigue failure type of mechanism of injury, where we're getting these kind of repeated cycles, whether it's in an acute or chronic period, where they're getting this gradual degradation of the tissue, and there's this misbalance between remodeling and damage. So potentially an athlete is performed acutely, whether that's over the course of a match, repeated cycles of high intensity decels and change directions, potentially with suboptimal technique, or potentially over a chronic period of time, whether it's over 3 or 4 or months, where we're getting gradual weakening of that tissue. There's a mismatch between remodeling and damage, maybe some suboptimal nutrition strategies, and then gradually that tissue is becoming weaker and weaker. And what was previously a submaximal load, because athletes perform hundreds of change directions during training match play, now that's become a maximal load, which exceeds the tolerance capacity, like the brakes going in your car. Eventually, the brakes wear out and they no longer function. But in our case, we get a catastrophic injury. The difficulty is, so that this has been shown like more in lab-based studies, so like with cadavers, where they've repeatedly exposed the tissue to repeated cycles of like combined internal rotation moments and arteriotibial shear, and then gradually you get weakening of the tissue from submaximal loads. The difficulty is monitoring tissue strength or ACL properties in vivo in live humans. So I suppose what we need to do is be careful and mindful in trying to achieve that tissue homeostasis and trying to get that maintenance of, I suppose, that tissue quantity, but it's very difficult to monitor. So we need to be mindful of, I suppose, rapid spikes and high intensity exposures to accels, decels, change of directions, and so on. But I haven't come across any study that's looked at the previous maybe ACL load in history of these injuries, or maybe the kind of workload that led to those injury scenarios. So we're seeing a lot of great work by studies identifying the visual mechanisms of injury. I think we kind of know the scenarios now, but what was their workload the day before or the week prior or the 2 or potentially the month leading? Was there a spike acutely in decels and change direction prior to that injury? Equally, were they underexposed? Because there's a bit of, we don't want to undercook our athletes as well. Trying to monitor that is very difficult, and I don't think our monitoring practices of multi-directional load are great as well. Yes, we're monitoring accel decel count, but not too many systems will provide context in terms of change of direction metrics. I believe Andrew Gray through ADI has worked on a very good system. So his system will allow Catapult and Stat Sports users to export their data into his software. And he's arguing that traditional metrics are underrepresented the true mechanical cost of multi-directional sports. So he's definitely someone I would encourage you to speak to if you haven't done so already. But he's been very thought-provoking, and he's arguing that we should be quantifying, I believe, mechanical power during our sessions, and we're able to get the cost of these change of direction actions, deceleration actions. We're getting a true representation of the cost of these different type of drills and activities during match play and training. But my PhD student at United, I believe, is working on his own, that you're using different kind of physics equations to basically derive that from just simple position data as well. So it can be done, but I just think we need to be better monitoring the multi-directional activities that we're doing in training and match play, which could be potentially leading to these catastrophic scenarios. And just one final one, there's some really good work by Lee Harrington that examined, this is retrospective analysis, but I believe they interviewed some athletes who sustained an ACL. I think it was female netball and hockey players. And they just interviewed them into asking what kind of led up to the injury. And I believe a large proportion of them reported like a fatiguing event within the week prior. What that fatiguing event was, I don't know. But they mentioned feeling kind of a significant fatiguing event prior to that. And anecdotally, from speaking to practitioners who work in women's soccer, where there seemed to be this kind of rise in frequency, whether the relative rate's gone up, I'm not too sure, but we seem to be caring about women's sport now. There seems to be a lot more media coverage about it, but I've heard anecdotally that some females have reported against significant life events in the week prior to their ACLs as well, which could go into a kind of maybe different mechanism there. But in terms of obviously what can we do as a practitioner, the biomechanics and exposure to load is definitely something that we can do as a modifiable risk factor.
Yep. No, it's fantastic. Yeah, thanks for sharing those insights, and I'll make sure to check out the research and add that to the show notes as well. That would be fantastic for the listeners to check out. Was it Rob Gray? Oh, Andrew Gray and Lee Harrington. Yeah.
Right. So there is some advancements in technology now with, like, obviously the foot insoles as well, potentially some of the wearables that have given you some estimates of load potentially. But yeah, it is very difficult to load to monitor the loading experience directly at the knee.
And is that, if we're going above and beyond, and let's say through screening and parents having ACL, high risk population, let's just say with a squad, and you've identified maybe 8 athletes of your squad of 40 that you might be identified as high risk, what would be the sort of non-negotiables to put in a best practice? Do you think, is it insoles? What would be the best protocols do you think to put in place at the moment with what we have access to?
Yes, a great question. So I apologize, I didn't answer it before in terms of the screening, the movement quality as such. So I think as part of like your tested battery, so like you mentioned, you want to find out the family history. I believe there's certain genetic profiles that could potentially predispose athletes to greater risk, but we can't go through gene modification and that type of stuff. But I think understanding the family history, doing your kind of typical musculoskeletal screening, obviously looking at certain musculoskeletal structures, certain mobility, flexibility, that type of stuff. There'll be certain kind of strength qualities that we'll want to examine. So particularly hamstring and quadriceps, ideally through the gold standard, through isokinetics. And I know some clubs are quite reluctant to try and implement that because of the time-consuming nature. But if I haven't come across an alternative way of assessing eccentric quadriceps strength easily in the field. For hamstrings, it's not a bit easier with obviously the Nor board and other various configurations of that, but it's very difficult to assess eccentric quadriceps strength. But that's going to be a key factor in terms of supporting those large external knee flexor moments. But generally, we want to assess some of the kind of key physical qualities there: knee spanning and knee spanning musculature, so around the glute area, in terms of like knee valgus, external hip rotation, and abduction. A bit of evidence about soleus strength being key as well to create that posterior shear force, and we need adequate hamstring strength as well for dynamic knee joint stability as well. Trunk control would be another key area. How, again, we assess trunk control is quite difficult. A lot of the tests are quite endurance based. I suppose there will be a fatigue related element as well. But then more importantly, we'll probably want to evaluate like the movement quality. So ideally 3D motion capture, where we can assess the kind of the joint kinetics and kinematics would be great, but it's very difficult to perform large mass screening. I know there's been certain organizations where it's been compulsory for certain teams in the league to do the screening. I believe like in Oslo, their research group, they've tested a lot of the floorball and handball players that screened hundreds of their female athletes. So this has led, due to those difficulties, this has led to kind of more the field-based testing. So we've developed kind of video-based screening tools where you could potentially do 2D analysis. So Gillian Weir developed a 2D screening tool where you'll be measuring certain joint kinematics and trunk positions and lower limb positions. But the issue with 2D analysis is obtaining quality footage in the frontal plane, so trying to avoid parallax error, which can be quite difficult to measure certain joints, for example. So if we wanted to measure knee valgus, and if the athlete wasn't positioned square to the camera or frontal plane projection angle, if they're slightly rotated, you can't get an accurate measure of that. So that could be one difficulty of relying on 2D analysis. There's qualitative screening tools that could stem from the key injury mechanisms. So I would normally, depending on the sport, try to evaluate some form of landing movement quality, some form of maybe deceleration movement quality, and ideally maybe a cut-in and a turn-in task. So for Aussie rules football, you think about the main injury mechanisms there. You've got your jump landing, probably some decels, acute cuts, and maybe some aggressive turns. For kind of netball, volleyball, maybe thinking more of like a jump landing perspective. But for soccer, probably get those kind of different mechanisms. So In soccer, we see a lot of pressing related mechanisms of injury. Typically, when you're accelerated to an opponent and trying to win the ball back, and they might move with the ball, and then you have to decel and slam on the brakes. So we could go from one extreme. We go from very generic, simple tasks, no externally directed attention. How well does someone drop from a box? How well does someone perform a sidestep cut? And we could film in the front and the side and examine key technical characteristics, like we've mentioned before: trunk position, lower limb alignment, penultimate foot contact strategies, how much kind of range of motion they go through, are they displaying asymmetries, and so on. Do we perceive them to be landing in an ideal technical model during decel, change direction, turn in, and jump landing tasks? Then, if someone's performing it well, can we increase the difficulty? So land from a higher drop height, progress to single leg, increase the approach speed, manipulate the change of direction angle, increase the approach momentum for those tasks. Okay, that's displaying safe mechanics for what we perceive to be safe, visually from a movement quality perspective. Okay, can we add some acute fatigue maybe, because there could be a fatigue mechanism injury? There's a lot of debate for ACL. But again, how robust are those mechanics when we add some acute fatigue? Then we can progress the complexity again and add some neurocognitive challenges. So some of the work by like Dustin Grooves and some of the group there doesn't have to be a sport-specific stimulus, but can we challenge them? So when they're performing their jump landing or their cut, can you put up some simple mathematics for them to recall, or a number or a color for them to remember while they're doing the task? So yes, it lacks ecological validity, but we're challenging the neurocognitive and the neurosensory element of the system. And there's evidence showing that externally directed attention increases these knee joint loads. And depending on the sport, particularly in soccer, there does seem to be a neurocognitive error leading up to that injury. So a lot of these injuries, I know, go back to soccer again. A lot of the women, especially women's soccer, they seem to make bad decisions and press an opponent, try and win the ball back when maybe it wasn't on, if that makes sense. Or they get deceived by the opponent, so they will accelerate, try and decelerate to the opponent, and then they'll shift the ball and go the wrong direction, and then they're in this really compromised position. And that's where we can start going up to maybe more sport-specific scenarios if the athlete has earned the right for that. But if an athlete isn't moving well in a pre-planned environment, I don't think there's any need to go and increase the complexity of the task. But equally, if someone's moving well in a pre-planned, I think you do need to challenge them to some extent. I know we're restricted with time. I suppose one alternative is studying film footage during match play and seeing how they move. I know it takes a bit of time, but if your performance analysis can clip some footage, or if you've got time to start evaluating how they move. In terms of alternative technologies, then we've got some of the foot insoles, but then you're only getting the load in. It still isn't great. There's still a lot of work to be done there. You have the IMU systems, so technologies such as XNs or MoveTrue or Naraxon, which can provide some kind of joint kinematics, but then we start getting to issues with validity and reliability. So a lot of those sagittal plane metrics have been validated, but generally the validity isn't as great for frontal plane and transverse variables, but they seem to be some of the most hazardous loading parameters as well. So it is a difficult situation to try and profile movement and injurious profile in the field. I still think there's a lot of advancements in technology. We've got markerless technology as well. Systems such as like Thea, computer vision techniques as well. Again, the validity is still questionable. The sagittal plane mechanics seem to be okay, but again, those frontal plane parameters and transverse are definitely not as accurate, which has important implications when you're trying to risk profile your athletes, because if you're trying to do an intervention and someone improves, is that just due to inconsistencies or inaccuracies in the technology, or has your athlete actually improved their technique? So you want to make sure it's down to the athlete, not due to instrumentation error as well. But I still think we're a long way off from these kind of gold standard techniques in the field, unfortunately. But I think as a minimum, we should be understanding how our athletes move, whether it's visually, coach's eye, or using video-based technology.
Yeah. And generally speaking, when you're looking at the vision, what are some sort of telling signs where you feel like, they do lack the sort of physical capacity and they need to spend a bit more longer time in the gym, whether it be through the qualitative stuff, or just simply from testing, like soleus, the soleus aspect you mentioned, hamstring, quad aspect?
Yeah, no,
What do
great
you go
question.
to,
So
I guess, as well from a prescription point of view to bridge the gap?
yeah, great question. So I suppose once we've identified those technical deficits, I suppose it's the job of the multidisciplinary team to understand why the athlete is moving that way. So some certain aspects, it could just be a simple cueing issue. The athlete was just unaware that they were moving in that position. So sometimes from a motor skill learning, cueing the athlete may acutely change that, but then the issue is getting that retention in the field. Generally, a lot of these times it could be like a physical capacity or a mobility issue. So, for example, we might do all the cueing to try and address lateral trunk flexion, for example. But if they haven't got adequate activation of the trunk stabilization musculature, that might warrant some dedicated intersegmental control testing and training. So maybe testing some of the support musculature around the trunk and pelvis, for example, and some directed conditioning there. Again, if someone's displaying knee valgus, you could again try to do all the cueing in the well, but then this is where maybe some of the isolated testing, or is it a structural issue as well? Why is that athlete collapsing into knee valgus, for example? Is it an issue at the hip, or is it an issue at the foot and ankle, for example? So if it's maybe at the hip, you might delve into your isolated testing, single joint testing around the hip. So maybe looking at external hip rotation or hip abduction, seeing if there's any kind of strength deficits there, or even in a more sophisticated scenario, even looking at muscle activation patterns. Equally, if it's a kind of a foot issue, if they're pronating, maybe looking at certain kind of musculature around there, or maybe an orthotics issue. So it's kind of delving in, where can we go to try and bridge that gap there. From a breaking strategy, again, from an ACL rehab, we know some athletes may adopt some compensation strategies. So if someone doesn't want to load up their penultimate foot contact, I would want to maybe examine particularly knee extensor strength. So is the issue that they're just unaware and unsure of how to load up that limb during deceleration, or is this a hiding strategy because they haven't got the knee extensor strength to tolerate the large breaker forces, or to generate those large breaker forces and to support the large knee external, the knee flexion external moments that we create. So that might be a reason why contralateral injury risk is typically greater. And we found this in some of the lab studies, but even acutely and visually from working with athletes, we see some athletes not trying to avoid and load up that penultimate foot contact, and that could be a strength issue or a fear of re-injury because that may have been the previous injury. So they may start to favour their unaffected side. And like we mentioned before, they'll start distributing more loading during that limb when they're cutting for that leg. But equally, when they're cutting from their previously injured side, they'll start to load up their penultimate foot contact because that's the potentially stronger limb there as well. Then you may start to look at, if someone just is spending too much time on the ground, you might start looking at ankle properties and maybe reactive strength qualities there as well. But ultimately, it's kind of reverse engineering. Yes, we've identified the technical deficit, but then unpicking why does the athlete move that way? So motor control, is it strength? Is it mobility? And that's probably the job of the MDT, maybe generating your own kind of frameworks. So it's great to appreciate this movement quality, but why did it move that way? And then what are the kind of interventions that we can apply? Just from experience, we've been able to do technique modification and cueing has been really effective. So integrating that work into a warm-up or your field-based session has been really effective. And there's quite a few number of studies now showing like over 6 weeks, we can adopt safer strategies and either maintain, so without to detriment of performance, or potentially even enhance performance. So I've been able to enhance performance. We may also get some favorable changes in muscle activation as well. So yes, the mechanics may not change, but if we're getting good supporting co-activation, that's going to offset some of that loading, but that's going to be very difficult to monitor as well. But generally, it probably will be a multi-component program that you'll need.
Yep. Yeah, well said. Thanks for that time. Appreciate the answer. Last question regarding this topic before we start to wrap it up. Of your time, I guess, with the from a coaching perspective, what are some of your favorite sort of constraints to change for that late stage when you're preparing athletes, I guess, to team training, from a stimulus point of view of that perception aspect and making it more of a reactive aspect. So they've ticked off the capacity stage. They've ticked off the competence from efficiency point of view with your change of direction, and now you're trying to add as much chaos as possible. Do you film that phase and review the vision, or is it more of a gut feel that you start to see and ask the athletes, how are you feeling? Are you confident? What's some of your key metrics, I guess, once they've hit all the physical and now you're preparing them for that, essentially to play phase. Process there to I guess mitigate risk once you're preparing them for the ultimate.
That's a great question. So I still think it's this kind of area still in its infancy in terms of the return to play when we're introducing the change of directions, especially the return to play batteries in the evidence and the literature as well, in terms of the optimal tests to use. Ultimately, you probably will need a spectrum of tests, probably pre-planned and unplanned, or examining the game footage. I suppose in terms of like the rehabilitation philosophy, I still like to introduce maybe change direction elements quite early. So we've been working on like a bit of a framework. So I think I like to deconstruct cutting, decel, turning. So even during phases, as long as the kind of like key aspects of pain and obviously regaining range of motion, I would still like to introduce some elements of kind of decel positions, cutting positions, turning positions, whether it's through isometric holds initially, and maybe low-level landing stabilization or banded exercises as well to get into the postures that we want. Low-level landing stabilization exercises to plyometrics. So that's kind of a bit of a continuum. And then essentially deconstruct cutting, turning, and decel. So a lot of banded walk exercises, banded lateral exercise, getting into the postures. We use kind of like slingshot exercises. So pulling the athlete with a band, getting into kind of the decel posture. So initially, I would want to be trying to master them, probably using coach's eye and listening for the sound, because generally you will be hearing athletes slamming on the brakes, and even just asking them, how did that feel? And they from some of the rehabbers, ACLs that we've worked with recently, they kind of know when they've hit like a really good decel position or loaded up the kind of penultimate foot contact to a greater extent. So I do require focus a lot on how the athlete feels on that. In addition to coaching those optimal positions, once we feel like we're happy that they master some of the kind of key positions, we do work on like compromise positions. So developing that repetition without repetition and subtle movement variability, because we're not always going to be in those ideal positions. So to use the penultimate foot contact, for example, there will be times when you can't load that inside leg and you will have to save it for that main final step. So there will be scenarios where we will add some movement variability, particularly towards the late stages where they're trying to cut and change the direction or turn from compromised positions. So during a 180-degree turn, rather than loading up that penultimate, you haven't broke effectively there, but now you need to change direction from that compromised position. So you're loading up the outside leg a bit more, playing with subtle variations and lateral trunk flexion. So they do have to get out of those compromised positions within reason. We then start to build up approach velocity and angle as well. So they're going to be your key regulators for intensity. So getting enough exposure to them, but again, reinforcing some of the key mechanics that we're after. If we have time, we will film them as well, because they should be having some rest periods in between. So we'll be looking for kind of key aspects of like trunk position, lower limb alignment, and that type of stuff. Monitor the number of like deceleration steps as well. Can we visually see any clear avoidance or compensation strategies? We do try to encourage them to load their previously injured side and get them more confident with that. And that's going to be, like you mentioned before, going to be driven by restoring those key physical qualities, particularly like those rate of force development qualities, and then increasing confidence through our landing stabilization and plyometric activities as well, and then increasing the confidence there. Mm-hmm. Then just adding kind of generic stimuli as well, where we start going into our kind of control to chaos approach. So it could just be externally directed attention. So they might run, I might be holding up a hand. They just need to count how many fingers I'm holding up there. It could be kind of generic reactions, whether it's colors or react to simple body movements from myself. I might play about with the preparation times that they're afforded. So I might introduce the stimulus quite early and then start challenging it more. That's one difficulty of these reactive kind of lab-based tasks where we're trying to do reactive agility for screening is the timing of the stimulus, because if we do it too late, it's going to not afford them enough preparation time as well. And that's what we're trying to do with our athletes. If we could develop their anticipatory skills so they can recognize the stimulus or process that information quickly, that's going to afford them greater preparation time to activate their appropriate musculature, but also coordinate their joints and the segments to get to the correct positions as well. I believe VR, virtual reality and video-based training could be a really powerful tool. So I think we could introduce that quite early on. Can we get our athletes to better recognize stimulus or multiple forms of stimuli, particularly if you're working, let's just say, for example, probably the more so with your healthy athletes, if you're going to be playing against a certain winger in rugby, can your performance analysis obtain lots of video footage of that defender or attacker that you're going to be playing against? Maybe using immersive reality environments, putting you in scenarios where you're able to process video footage of that athlete that you may be encountering. I think that's going to be the next steps. And I know if you watch some of the NFL documentaries, you see some of the quarterbacks, they put them in immersive environments where they're able to simulate match play to get better represent the environments that they're going to encounter. So if we could do that, so they're better able to recognize opponents, attacking plays, certain cues the athlete does, you're shifting a reactive scenario to an anticipatory scenario, which should reduce the loading and aid performance. But now you're delving into a completely different area of like motor control and skill acquisition there. But I think that could be a powerful area where your athlete isn't reacting to stimuli. Can they process or anticipate so they're getting into the correct position? They know the athlete's going to cut that direction and they're not in that compromised position, for example. And then towards the latter stages, okay, then I suppose one issue is a lot of these change directions aren't performed in solo. It depends on the nature of the sport, but like in soccer, they might perform change directions in dense action. So it isn't just one cut, but like a central midfielder, for example, they might run, cut, go to another opponent. So I was looking at the density of actions. So that would be another thing that I'm looking at. Okay, yes, an athlete moves well from like a 5x5 cut at 45 degrees, but what are they like when they had to start chaining different movements together? So, okay, in a 10-second period, you've got 3 rapid accels to decels there. How are their mechanics under there? Because that's going to represent more of those worst case scenarios that they're going to encounter in sport. And then it kind of relays back to control to chaos continuum. Then you start going into more of those pitch-based activities, small-sided games, more representative learning. So they are exposed to kind of the density of actions as well. What I probably will say is when you are going to those unplanned scenarios, the athletes do tend to slow down. We've all probably done that simple Y agility cue drill where an athlete runs to a coach and then they need to cut to the left or right, and the athlete just completely slows down. So that I'm still a big proponent of pre-planned change direction to expose them to those higher mechanical loads, because we're getting better at quantifying the multi-directional activity demands of sport, but a lot of the turns aren't occurring actually at phenomenally high approach velocities. They're occurring at maybe 4 to 5 meters per second, which is still relatively quick, but it's not from 7-8 meters per second. So there's a lot of more of these kind of submaximal based approach velocities when it comes to change of direction. So still getting your athlete accustomed to those higher mechanical loads, in my opinion, is still important. And I suppose one issue with small-sided games is ensuring everyone gets like a fair multi-directional stimulus. Do athletes start deferring back to old movement patterns? So it's again putting some constraints in place so they are getting equal exposure, maybe to kind of from left and right limbs or a range of different multi-directional actions in there as well. So small-sided games are great because you get the simultaneous technical tactical development, but I think it just needs to be clever in terms of the constraints or acknowledge some of the limitations in there, because sometimes your best players may receive more of the ball, or
Yeah.
They might not do as much running, for example, because they've got such great game intelligence. They know where to position themselves, so they don't have to do as much pointless running, for example. So that's just something to be mindful of, where people are big proponents of small-sided games, which have their time in place. But I think there's still times where you need to be more prescriptive to try to elicit the specific stimulus and adaptation that you want. So sometimes some pre-planned drills or some more isolated drills with certain constraints in there could be an appropriate solution for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to it.
It's very difficult. And then trying to achieve transfer to sport. I had a good discussion with a practitioner yesterday, and then trying to hope that transfers into on-field performance is I suppose, the golden question. And I don't know if we're fully at that stage yet, but we hope that the main thing is make sure that our athletes are physically prepared to tolerate those loads that they will encounter in sport, and then monitoring those loads with better multi-directional load monitoring practices. That's kind of my philosophy. And then delving into the perceptual cognitive side, probably consulting with the skills coach is a big element, but probably seek some additional expertise from motor control, motor skill acquisition experts, because there's experts there who probably did in this area for 10, 15, 20 years who can advise on the certain cues that we use, the kind of practice in this structure. Do we adopt block, serial, random type of environments? What constraints can we do to try and improve the retention of skills that ultimately we want our athletes to be fast movers and fast thinkers, but we want those mechanics to be unconscious, unconscious competent. Ultimately, that is what we're after. But I think it's going to be that MDT approach for that.
Yeah. I guess that's it's something that we've perhaps at times undervalue, the decision-making process, and like you said, using virtual reality, the cognitive space, maybe monitoring cognitive fatigue as well as a potential risk factor going into sessions and games. I guess the hardest part is then being able to be proactive, and you never know the ones you avoided. You only know the ones that occur, but I guess if we can put robust plans in place, like you said, the physical competency, and ensuring that we're preparing the athlete as best we can for their game and how they play and the positions that they're going to hit, and the density side of things as well, with the access that we do have to GPS. Then ultimately the athlete should feel pretty confident when they're returning to play. And I think it sounds like there's obviously lots that go into it, but there's plenty more that's sort of moving in this space as well. You mentioned virtual reality. Is there other things that you think sort of on the forefront from a research perspective, moving into best practice from reconditioning as well as performance?
Yeah, I suppose it's developing that kind of multi-directional speed testing battery, and I suppose acknowledging some of the limitations of that. But I think we do need to improve our understanding and recommendations for the best type of change direction and deceleration tests as well, or style of deceleration. I don't think a lot of people are actually examining deceleration qualities. It requires a bit more sophisticated equipment. You don't see that in too many of these kind of recommended testing batteries that have been proposed by different organizations. And then when it comes to change of direction, I suppose it's appreciated that, like we just mentioned before, there's so many different types of change of direction angles, and there's a spectrum of different angles that athletes need to be competent at. My philosophy is developing robust 360-degree athletes, and I think that will apply for most sports, particularly Aussie rules football with a big oval that you guys play in. And there's a lot of evidence showing that actually a lot of the agility scenarios in Aussie rules football actually isn't 1v1 situations. The defender or the attacker the defender will be side on or behind. So it's preparing them for those different scenarios. But I think you would need to ideally examine both left and right limbs across generally some form of shallow to moderate and sharp change direction angle. That's what I normally would advise, looking at deceleration qualities as a unique task, and then add in some complexity to that as well, whether it's with externally directed attention or a neurocognitive error or some form of reactive stimulus. But just appreciating that an athlete might move well in a lab-based or these kind of planned or restricted tests. But I appreciate it's completely different once you've got 50,000 people in a pitch. You've got so many different sources of information to process, different forms of stimuli, and you're thinking about winning, to be honest. There's a bit of evidence now with more of the lab-based or field-based measures of movement quality to create more sport-specific tests. So there's some good Italian and Dutch research groups start to play about with the kind of more wearable sensors to do more ecologically valid testing on the pitch. But again, athletes, we still need to probably, you had the issues with compliance of wearables, and ultimately athletes can't really wear like lower body wearables. It's hard enough getting compliance with GPS and governor bodies to adhere to that. But I think if we could get to a stage where the invisible monitoring of these specific movement patterns, where the athlete is kind of you tested without testing as such, would be really powerful. But I still think we're a long way off for getting valid and reliable metrics. But hopefully it's just appreciating, if where possible, evaluating decel as a separate quality and cuts and change directions of different angles, and then just integrating that with your kind of movement quality assessments, your biomechanical assessments, but also the physical capacities of the athlete as well, to try and unpick strengths, areas for improvement, and why that athlete could be moving that way.
100%. Yeah, that's fantastic. No, I appreciate it, Tom, all the work that you've done in this space, as well as both research perspective, but obviously practically as well, coaching yourself and reconditioning athletes. On the moving on to some more personal note, pet peeves, anything that sort of fires you up from an industry perspective or from a work perspective?
Pet peeves. I hate email chains. I suppose people being disorganized, but I hate when people ask to organize a meeting but won't provide availability in advance. So, are you free for a meeting? And it's just like, let's cut the number of emails. You tell me, are you available for a meeting? I'm available XXXX these dates. It will cut the amount of unnecessary email chains. But yeah, that is kind of a pet peeve, disorganization and unnecessary conversation. There's to be more direct and instructive with that type of stuff.
Yeah, I love it. I can appreciate that. What about favorite way to spend a day off?
I like being outdoors. I've got a young son as well, so spending time with him playing as well, and then getting out for walks, getting out in the nature where possible. And I suppose comedy is also good as well. Go and see some comedians is also fun. Yeah, a good way. And my wife, I can't miss out my wife as well. I spend time with my wife and son.
Yep. This one I've added just recently to the run sheet, which I think is quite good. I think I listened to a recent podcast, another podcast show, and I think it's quite a good question. But is there one opinion or belief that you hold that's against the mainstream or challenges a popular consensus? It doesn't have to be on multiple speed.
Oh, that's great. A really powerful book, and podcast host now as well, is Cal Newport, and he's got a book called Be So Good They Can't Ignore You. And it's controversial, but he argues that following your passion isn't necessarily the best advice. And he argues, yes, you need to have some interest in it, but just because you're passionate about something doesn't mean you necessarily will be good at it, and you should follow your career in it. For example, lots of people want to be personal trainers, yoga instructors, but what's going to help you stand out from the crowd, which is ultimately going to give you job and career satisfaction. So it was a very thought-provoking book, and he argues developing rare and invaluable skills should be the thing that will ultimately should make you more in demand, give you more control, more job satisfaction and career satisfaction. So it's definitely worth a read and listening to his podcast. I think he's really big proponent of deep work and schedule. He's been, from an academic perspective, he's had a big influence on me as well. But yeah, that passion, I think, isn't necessarily always the optimal advice. Yeah, I'm really passionate about the area that I'm in, but you need to develop some rare and invaluable skills in that area as well to show worth. Otherwise, you're just the same as everyone else, I suppose.
Yeah, that's great. I like that.
So yeah, that's my mantra. Like, be so good they can't ignore you, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then obviously the recording of this is early April 2025. What's on the horizon, mate? What are you most excited about for the rest of the year?
Uh, uh, Great question. I'm looking forward to my son's at a great age, so he's 19 months now. So I'm looking forward to seeing him develop and practicing some sports skill. He loves kicking a ball, throwing a ball, so I'm looking forward to seeing him develop. Professionally, look forward to some of my PhD students, do some more research. We've got a few projects, work with a few companies, work with Photon Sports on like multi-directional speed profiling and camera-based systems. So I'm excited to see how that develops. And we work with another company called Move True, which is a wearable sensor as well. So that could hopefully revolutionize our movement screening. So I'm excited about that. And then I suppose doing a few kind of fitness competitions and as well, which would be good to do, which I'm excited about. I did a
What's
high
High Rock
rocks
Club?
earlier. I did a high rocks earlier this year, so all your viewers going to probably hate me now, but I've done traditional lifting for like 15 years now, so it's good to do something a bit different. So yeah, a few variants of those type of fitness competitions. Got a few 10Ks as well. I'm sounding like the right gimmick trying to do all the hybrid type of athletes. So I'm still doing my Olympic lifting, but trying to do my endurance stuff as well, which has been a good challenge. So yeah, looking forward to that type of stuff really.
Fantastic. Yeah, did you do the individual High Rocks or
Oh no,
partner?
I'm not that mad just yet. So did doubles with or mixed doubles with my sister-in-law, so she's into it. So yeah, got some other variants of competitions as well, and then just looking to beat the times in the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, they do a good job. I did it with my brother
Oh
last year.
really?
I was impressed how well it was run. The
Yeah,
whole DC build up with the 10-second countdown in the tent before you launch into it, and yeah, it's a well run event. So for anyone that hasn't heard of High Rocks, go Google it. It's taking over the world,
yeah.
really.
Well, I believe so. My colleague Phil Graham Smith, I think he's on the biomechanics advisory board for them now. So I think he's going to be doing some researches and projects with them, try to optimize some of the stations. But yeah, obviously it's exploded, and I think that's definitely going to be another area in revenue for terms of kind of strength conditioning and sports medicine. I think what did they start off with a few hundred in 2017? Now they got tens of thousands of athletes. It's becoming a sport itself. So could be an area that could delve into. But yeah, it's just good to do something a bit more endurance based, not just squats and Olympic lifts all the time. So
For sure. Yeah, a
yeah,
nice carrot to train for it, and I like it. Well, thanks, Thomas. I appreciate you coming on. You did mention off air your website, Multi-Directional Speed. What's the full website for those that want to connect? Where's
yes.
the best
So
to
we've got
us?
a company called Science of Multi-Directional Speed. So I think some of the handles will be like Sci of Multi Speed. So we're on LinkedIn, Instagram, X. So we disseminate a lot of blog content. So myself, I've created blogs on there, all related to different aspects of multi-directional speed. We've got Alistair McBurney, Paul Jones, Chris Bremer, Damien Harper, Chris Thomas, and we get guest contributors, so some of the leaders in the area on certain aspects of multi-directional speed and general sports science and S&C. So give it a please check it out. We're hoping to release some kind of courses related to screening tools. And then myself and Paul Jones have also published a book on the science of multidirectional speed or multidirectional speed science research to application as well. So we've done some chapters and we've got some really good contributors and leaders in Excel, decel, change direction rehab in there as well. So if anyone's interested, get in contact or check out some of those resources.
Yeah, no, that sounds like great resources. We'll definitely add all the links in the show notes. So for those perhaps driving to the car, listening to the recording, you'll be able to access them really easily and connect with Tom and yeah, make sure to check out that research. I think I just looked at the website before. There's a blog post with those articles and
Yeah.
so dive in S&C coaches
No,
and if they're interested. But yeah, thank you again for jumping on and sharing with us some practical tips around deceleration, both from performance perspective, but also reconditioning. For those that tuned in live, if you tuned in halfway through, you can find the whole episode on our YouTube channel. We'll release it on our podcast in the next few weeks. And our next live chat is with Jared Wade, which will be 8:30 p.m. on April 9th. So I look forward to seeing you guys then.